Oh. Yeah, making it easy, Jesus. Shrewd manager. We have 5 parables in a row in Luke chapter 15 and Luke chapter 16. Last week we had 2 of those parables, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. And at the end of chapter 15, we didn't get it, but we spoke to it in the sermon, is the parable of the lost child. So the parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost child, otherwise known as the parable of the prodigal son, probably misnamed. In chapter 16, we have 2 more parables with a very different tenor. Those first 3 were like parables about grace, about God rejoicing when lost things are found, and these are the parables of judgment, as you could tell. They have a very different tenor. The parable of the dishonest manager is this first one up to chapter 16, verse 13. And the next one is the parable of the poor man. His name is Lazarus, and the rich man who steps over him every day and ignores his need. But this parable of the dishonest manager is the most difficult, I think, of all of Jesus' parables. One commentator called this parable is the problem child of all parables. And I believe it, because I've been looking at it all week here. Even trying to name my sermon, it was difficult. The first slide we went with was kind of boring, sort of Monopoly game piece, the shrewd manager. And so then I went to the opposite edge of that. This is kind of the boring edge. And I went to the opposite edge of it, monkey business. But then I realized if we put that into the paper, that could be just really misconstrued, and maybe that's not the best one. So I thought coming back to the middle somewhere respectable enough, so I settled onto this title, Under New Management. I know. Did you like that one better, the monkey business? Yeah. We almost had monkey business in the paper, but then I thought better. So to understand what new management is, you have to understand what old management was, or what it was like, and to do that, you have to understand something about the economic system in the first century, the one in which Jesus is addressing. Now, in the first century, Rome was the conqueror, right, of this territory and almost all territories around this, and they, like any conqueror, would come in and they would exploit the natural resources and exploit the labor of the conquered people. Now, because of a treaty that was made between King Herod and the Caesars, they didn't have to be conscripted into the military, so all the men in Israel didn't have to go into the military, and they could keep their own religion. That's a really weird caveat for the first century in which we have this envelope of Jesus, is they didn't have to do that. But if you were in Syria, those things happened. But due to the shrewd dealing of King Herod, they weren't forced to do those things. And Rome then chiefly exploited people by taxation. Now, I know, you can't imagine that rich people would get off without paying much tax and the poor would have to pay a lot of tax. I mean, there's no world in which we know that happening, but it happened then, right? And the rich lived in the south, which is the territory called Judah, and the poor, small farmers, they usually lived in the northern part of Israel. If you've been to Israel, you know the difference in the topography and why they would live up there. And the rich, they needed the wine, and they needed the wheat and the produce of the farmland in the north. And you'd think this was a great opportunity for the small farmers to get rich, right? But what would happen is that the Romans would impose heavy taxation on the small farmers. And this is why tax collectors were so unpopular in the New Testament. And their unpopularity is reflected in various stories in the New Testament. The farmers couldn't afford to pay the heavy taxation. Then their rich neighbors in Judah would come up and say, "Oh, don't worry about that, my poor neighbor. We will pay the taxes in exchange for the deed to your farm." Now, here's the great part of that deal. You don't have to worry, you won't move, but you just stay there and you serve as tenant farmers on our property. And you'll give us a percentage of the produce of your land every year, the wheat, the wine, the olive oil. And then the rich guys would sell that wheat for Roman banquets and wine for Roman tables, and the olive oil, one commentator said, maybe they were used for Caesar salad. Rome, Caesar, yeah. And so the guys in the south would get richer, and the people in the north would become more pressured and poorer. And if you understand that dynamic, you know that each year when the rich guys in the South wanted tribute from the crops in the North, they wouldn't go themselves. They would hire someone to be their intermediary because, first of all, it was a hassle to go. There was no bullet train. There was no internet. There was none of the fast ways in which we communicate. So they would hire a manager or a steward who would go up and get them to pay, 20 measures of wheat or 30 barrels of wine or, all that. So in our story today, there's a rich man who has a manager. Got a little more of the backstory about what the story is coming from. Maybe it starts to help you make sense of this story. And this rich guy is angry at his manager because he isn't putting enough effort into getting a bigger return out of the farmers in the north, his investment. And so he's asked him to squeeze the farmers hard enough that they would give him what he needed. But he's not doing that. So he decides he's going to fire this mid-level manager and replace him with somebody else. This story cutting a little closer now to our reality. The manager's caught in the middle between these two, right? He says, I've worked for years for this guy, and now he's going to fire me, and there's no Social Security, and he can't dig ditches. He's too old for that, and he's lived too high and mighty to beg, and so he's just not going to do that. And so he suddenly realizes that he is completely expendable. He understands that in this cycle, in this pyramid of power, he does not matter. And suddenly, it all becomes clear to him that he's a cog in a dehumanizing wheel, and he's been part of what's grinding these poor farmers who work hard, but they cannot make a living. Anybody a farmer out there today? Anybody feeling a little of this edge? He sees, maybe for the first time, the system that he's been working in and the place in the system where he's been working. And maybe he realizes that he just doesn't really matter. That by a week from Friday, after they give him his cake this Friday, nobody's going to remember him anymore. They're going to take away his email and his cell phone, and his desk will be somebody else's desk, and it won't matter. He will be invisible. He was expendable all along. He doesn't matter. So he decides something. He's going to switch sides. He's going to take the side of the poor farmer, and he starts to make them sweet deals. He arranges for a payment, but a much smaller payment than the tribute. We would call it pennies on the dollar. He's shrewd. Sometimes we make a manager into the bad guy. In this story, I've preached this every which way. I'm trying to find a new way to preach it, and here it is. Yeah, he's always been the bad guy because we always want him to make the owner, who we think is God, to look good in the parable. And it's impossible to make the owner or the manager look good in this parable. I've tried it over 27 years. Can't do it. It's just not possible. But what if these parables are about God's strange way of doing things in the world? Like the other parables. Like, what good shepherd would actually leave 99 perfectly good sheep in the wilderness to go out and search for that one lost sheep? I mean, who would search diligently night and day for one lost coin when they've got 9 perfectly good coins going, and the other one's going to turn up some point anyway? What's the worry? This woman who's sweeping. What if this is really about the value of lost things, even still? The things in the world that don't often matter. So what if this manager isn't someone who's evil, but the story is about someone who saw through an evil system, this economic system, and decided to switch sides and work for the poor? And this saves his soul. Or as the parable would put it, give him a place in eternal homes. There's a geeky Bible moment. Okay, so there's a word for home, oikos, and then there's a word for like the tent that God dwells in, the eternal dwelling. It's used at the beginning, oikos, like home. At the end, it means this traveling tent where God's presence always is. So this eternal homes is how it gets translated into the English. Any Bible geeks here? Or was that just a wasted moment? Sorry. One. All right. Thank you very much. Good. That was for you, Joe. So, this is an uncomfortable parable, isn't it? I mean, especially for those of us in a money-based economy. And not only is it uncomfortable, it's confusing. We're just not sure where we stand in this, because we'd like a simple moral tale, where the good guy's clear. There's clearly a white hat and there's a dark hat, and we know who the good guy is and the bad guy is, but that's just not how it is. If you doubt, that's the message, just keep reading. And Jesus, he's not afraid to say things that I'm afraid to say. Here's things he says. You better learn that money isn't the ultimate commodity in life. It's not the measure of all things. It would be better for you to learn to use your money in service of relationships instead of using your relationships in service of your money. It's not what you know, it's who you know. He's messing. 2,000 years later, he's messing with the way we do things. And Jesus goes on to say then, you cannot serve two masters. I wouldn't be brave enough to say what he says next. Love money and you hate God. You love God and you hate money. As I looked at my 401k while writing that line. But let's think a little bit about what money does. Money causes us to improperly value things. It has a value system. It's not passive. It's not outside the game. It is the game. And we have a culture that looks at us and sees our values. So, we're going to channel Amos a little bit. One of the things that he's harping on is Sabbath. How many of you have had a day where you took a true Sabbath? You did nothing but honor God. Even among the retired, there's not one who did nothing on a Sabbath day but honor God? No, and if you're working class folks, if you're still working in your job, if you have something to do on the Sabbath, well, that's important. We got to do that. We're going to be working on the Sabbath because, that's what's got to be done. Business has got to be done. Money's got to be made. We got to have a second job. We got to keep it going. Got to keep the economy going. I got to keep buying things, I got stuff. I got a house. I got people. So money causes us to improperly value things and to reassess value of how we live our lives. And so maybe one of the things we should be getting out of this, as Amos says, is you need to restore Sabbath for your own sake. Not God's. Sabbath isn't for God. Sabbath's for you. Sabbath is to take a break and to put it all down and to just rest in the assurance that God's got it under control. And we have a culture that looks like the Romans. I mean, most of our cultures look this way, at the rivers and the oceans and the soil, and we don't consider their inherent worth. No, we look at them as tools to serve our bottom line, right? I mean, that's really how it works. How can we convert them, or how can we use them, or how can we make money for those at the top of the economic pyramid? The school kids took to the streets this week in huge numbers over that precise issue. Money and the power that comes with it. It can brainwash us, can't it? How many of you spend as much, don't answer this, it'll be convicting, spend more time thinking about money and all the ways in which money is used and gathered and spent than you do thinking about God? It can blind us. If you feel resistant to what I'm saying, you join me. But consider how deep the hooks money has in us. It's really what makes our lives work, and they're quite deep hooks. Maybe we need to consider how wealth and the power that comes with it have led us to believe some pretty terrible things and to do some pretty terrible things, even to ourselves. One way to tell if someone's honoring God is to see how willing they are to do things that go against the grain of the culture's expectation, the value system, just because the new values are maybe the Jesus way to go. And this can even involve contradicting the predominant perspective of the Christian community if they fall into moral cowardice. So I was reading not too long ago, and I read, I'm reminded about the story of Huck Finn. Anybody remember Huck Finn? Anybody reading Huck Finn? Do they even still read Huck Finn? Nobody knows Huck Finn? Come on. Oh, okay. How about Mark Twain? You ever heard of that guy? Same people. Okay. There's still time to redeem your childhood for those of you who haven't read Huck Finn. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In this book, he describes a time when honoring God required going against the community's expectation of good Christian behavior by opposing slavery. Now, it's written at a particular time to send a particular message about slavery, of course. Many Christians at the time were using the Bible to justify slavery and condemn those who were working against it, the abolitionists. In Huck Finn's journey down the Mississippi River, he's been aiding and abetting a runaway slave. Anybody remember his name? Give yourselves a hand. Nicely done. Alita's got it back there. She knew it. Jim, which Huck's convinced is a sin, and he's going to be sent straight to hell. Well, Huck is conflicted, and he's guilt-ridden about what he's been doing, and so he decides to write a letter to Jim's owner, Miss Watson, a letter about where they are and what they're doing. And here's what it says. So I got to read it because it's Huck Finn. It's not what I would call his English. So Huck is thinking about these things as he sits there, and he's got the pen and the paper in hand, and he says, I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life. I have to say it like that because it helps me with some of the words. And I knowed I could pray now, but I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking about how good it was that all this happened so, and how near I come to getting lost and going to hell. And then I went on thinking. And I got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the night, and sometimes moonlight and sometimes storm, and we're floating along, talking and singing and laughing. I could not strike no place to harden myself against him, but only the other kind. I'd seen him standing my watch on top of his, instead of calling me so I could go on sleeping. And I see how happy he was when I got to feeling better. And when I come to him again in the swamp, how he'd always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could think of for doing for me, and how good he always was. And at last, I struck upon a time when I saved him by telling those men we had smallpox upon the boat, and how he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and now was only friend that Jim's got now. And then I happened to look around, and now I see the paper. It was right there. I took it up and I held it in my hands. I was trembling because I had to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and got saying to myself, you know what he said? All right then, I'll go to hell. And I tore up the letter. Ironically, the moment Huck says that he's going to go to hell rather than betray his friend is probably the moment that Huck is saved by honoring God in coming under new management by loving his friend. You know, the radical honor that is shown by Huck against the immoral ethos of the toxic, supposedly Christian society in which he lived around him is precisely what honoring God should inspire in us, like it did this dishonest manager in his day. What happened to Huck was that Jim's humanity caused him to be so cut to the heart that he could see the unjust system that no longer made any sense to him. And he decided, even if it was going to cost him hell, he decided to change sides. This is no more monkey business. No more monkey business. When we talk about honoring God or the fear of the Lord, we have to remember that God chose to represent himself most perfectly in becoming a victim of injustice to human systems in Jesus' death on the cross. Now, if that's the God who is, then honoring God is not about being afraid of what God might do to me, like sending me to hell, but afraid of what I might do to Jesus in my life. You get the difference? We often think that fearing God is about what God's going to do to me, so I'm afraid of God. That's not it. It's honoring God so that I become afraid of what I might do to the Jesus I meet in everyday life. My fear of the Lord isn't about me being afraid of what God's going to do. As a disciple, I'm afraid of how I will hurt Jesus in this life. You cannot serve wealth and God. Oh, I wish there was some third category. You cannot serve God and wealth. And it isn't because God is a jealous God in the way that we are jealous and greedy people. No, it's because if wealth is our highest value, people and creation will have to some degree less value. And when that happens, we offend God. The kingdom of God has an economic system. It doesn't settle for us having malnourishment coming from the rich and powerful. That's not the system. No, the system says absolutely everybody, the whole creation, matters to God. And so it should matter to us. Put God at the top, love God, and you will see everything in a new value system. You'll be under new management. Like the manager, we all, including me, have survival on our minds. I mean, how are we going to do that? Are we going to have enough money? Are we going to have enough Social Security? Are we going to have enough pension to make it, through our lives? Are we going to become a burden? For me, part of my survival thinking is, are we going to make it as church? The manager allows his desperation to show him something new. We should not forget that this parable's power lies in the ability to shock us into laying our sometimes most revered values at the foot of the cross. We hear today that we cannot serve wealth and God. But what other values, what sacred cows in our lives, what ways of believing or ways of doing things, what deep hurt, what shame that controls do we need to place at the foot of the cross in order to see things in a new way? What desperation in our own lives needs to help us open up a brand new tomorrow closer to God's presence? How can we come under new management with no more monkey business? Amen. Folks, let's sing together our sermon response. We'll get our worship team back.